Hello again, book lovers, and it's time for a review of a reread. It's Francis Spufford's I May Be Some Time, which is a history of polar exploration, focusing at the end on the famous Scott expedition, as the title would lead you to believe. Normally when I say this is a reread, so it's by default a recommendation, well, not always. I must have read this book maybe 30 years ago. It was given to me as a present by somebody who was working at the BBC. Now, why is that relevant? Well, coincidentally, this book has a very BBC... It's very cautious with words, it tiptoes around certain subjects, and it suffers a little bit, at least, especially at the beginning, of what I call generically lit crit, which I just don't get on with. In fact, the first two chapters I'd almost forgotten about entirely. And these, now that I've stepped into the same river twice, I found kind of annoying. There's a lot of analysis of the cultural zeitgeist, of the way polar exploration plays out in our imaginations, etc. In fact, a large part of the book is about that. It moves on to some more specific things, such as the Franklin exhibition and Lady Franklin's attempt to find her almost certainly dead husband. And the last three chapters, 8, 9 and 10 of this 350-page book, talk about Eskimos, then the men who took part in the mission, and finally the actual mission itself. At least a sort of sketch of it, as so much has been written about it. We have other sources for other elements. Right, okay, let's go positive. It's sort of polymath work, bowling along, taking all kinds of things into account as it tells the story. Sometimes this is good, sometimes I find it a little bit distracting. I find the writing style a little bit, well, I say BBC again, in that the passive voice is often used to make something seem like a fact, when in fact it's an opinion, the sort of it is generally known that kind of thing. It's very well researched, with some pedantic little turns that I'm quite fond of. For example, when we say Great Scott, are we referring to the polar explorer? No, we're not, says Mr. Spufford, because he can source Bertrand Russell using the expression when our Scott was probably 4 or 5 years old. Russell, and the expression, it seems, refers to Walter Scott. Good, I like these little insights. I like an anecdote. And there's plenty of those here as well. A nice one about the Prime Minister Balfour being accosted on his private train by a disturbed gentleman who Balfour then invited back to his house because he assumed it was somebody he had met and whose name he should have remembered. Yes, I like an anecdote. And in among the scene setting of the Victorian and Edwardian eras, we get quite a lot of period detail. A lovely little rhyme by Harry Graham is quoted on page 258 from Ruthless Rhymes for Heartless Homes. Are you ready? Billy, in his nice new sash, fell in the fire and burnt to ash. And now, although the room grows chilly, I haven't the heart to poke poor Billy. A nice little encapsulation of the kind of unsentimental Edwardian reaction to the over-sentimental Victorian era that preceded it. Okay, you'll notice I'm not talking a lot about the actual expedition because the book doesn't really go into the expedition until right at the end. And in general, to my mind as a fan of history, I thought the book got better and better as it moved towards its climax. But let me pick a little bit of Mr. Spufford's prose apart here, because although I did enjoy reading it, and I did reread it till the end, and I did gain things from it, I found on the second reading that I was picking things up that irritated me that 30-year younger me probably wouldn't have been irritated by. We learn how Isabella Stanley and William Edward Parry exchanged gifts before Parry went off to explore the polar regions. Bibles, of course. And then, parenthesis, he also gave her his recently drawn tooth to keep, while she lent him her pet dog Fido for company on the polar voyage. They were partners in gush, close brackets. Beg your pardon, Francis, that's a little bit judgmental, isn't it? There doesn't seem to be anything too out of the way in this exchanging of keepsakes and mementos. Let's go on to the sort of throwaway comment that does kind of irk me a little bit now. Maybe it's because we've had 40 years of it. Here we go. Technically Franklin's, Lady Jane's body was no longer her own in a directer way once it had been deliberately exposed to the gaze, hyphen, the male, in italics, gaze, hyphen, of the curious, and although the proper responses could be blah blah blah. Technically Franklin's. That's how Mr. Spufford is describing Lady Jane Franklin, presumably because we don't know if her husband has died or not, so under the law she would be technically Franklin's. But you know, let's shove that point in at the beginning and then let's emphasise it with the male gaze. But just a minute, you're telling us this gaze was drawn to her because of the exploits of her husband, which is not a particularly female area of interest. And it's as if there weren't women there pointing at her and making comments. I bet there were. And there's more in a similar vein on page 199, where the lit crit in Mr. Spufford is analysing a passage from Dickens, which contains the following. The foremost question is, not the nature of the extremity, but the nature of the men. We submit that the memory of the lost Arctic voyages is placed, by reason and experience, high above the taint of this so easily allowed connection. Close quotes. Mr. Spufford continues, why taint in inverted commas? Even when selected as an easy idiomatic metaphor for contaminated honour, smear in inverted commas does the same work. The word preserves its original vivid association with meat, and there you get it, you see. It's all something to do with the machinations of Mr. Dickens' mind, and even he didn't know what he really was talking about. Am I being cruel? Yes, I'm being very harsh. I don't reread books expecting not to like them, and I didn't dislike this one. It's just that the tone of it reminded me of our dear Archbishop of Canterbury, Mr. Justin Welby. Oh, by the way, it turns out Mr. Spufford is from a religious family. Whether he is or not, I don't know. But there is an idea of we must use the right terminology. We must show that we're aware of social injustice. We must be part of this battle for the better world. Not really what I want for my history book, but it really isn't bad. If you can put up with the flowery, pseudo-philosophical passages, there is a lot of meat on these bones. Might be seal meat, it might be full of worms, but there's definitely meat there, particularly, as I say, towards the end, when we get a few nice pen portraits of some of the unfortunate explorers, of whom, I should say, the ridiculously, obsessively, ascetically religious Wilson was my particular favourite.